The autumn wind carried death across the Wyoming Territory that morning in 1878. Though Charlotte Whitmore couldn't have known it as she pressed her face against the dusty window of the westbound stagecoach. She was 19 with auburn hair pinned beneath a traveling hat that cost more than most families earned in a month, and she was running toward freedom, or so she believed. Her fingers traced the edge of a crumpled letter hidden in her reticule, the paper worn soft from countless readings. Her father's words echoed in her memory. The territorial expansion requires certain sacrifices, my dear. Some eggs must be broken to make the omelet of progress. She had dismissed it as typical Theodore Whitmore rhetoric when she'd accidentally seen it among his private correspondence. Now fleeing his arrangements for her marriage to Senator Morrison's son, those words seemed oddly ominous. Miss, you might want to step away from that window, the grizzled driver had warned her at the last station. This stretch between Laramie and Cheyenne's been drawing trouble lately. But Charlotte had ignored him just as she'd ignored most warnings in her privileged Boston life. The daughter of railroad magnate Theodore Whitmore had never learned to fear anything more dangerous than a disapproving glance at a society dinner. The vast emptiness of the Wyoming prairie fascinated her mile after mile of sage-covered hills that rolled toward distant mountains like frozen ocean swells. The first gunshot shattered her reverie like glass. The coach lurched violently as the driver yanked the reins, his curses mixing with the thunder of pursuing hoofbeats. Charlotte was thrown against the opposite wall, her ribs screaming in protest as the vehicle careened around a sharp bend in the mountain road. "Bandits!" the driver shouted. "Everyone down!" But there was nowhere to go down. The coach was little more than a wooden box, balanced on springs and wheels, offering no protection from the bullets that began splintering the sides. Charlotte found herself on the floor, her expensive traveling dress tangled around her legs, staring up at an elderly merchant who was frantically trying to hide a leather satchel inside his coat. Through the chaos, she heard a voice that made her blood freeze, the Whitmore girl she's supposed to be alive for questioning. They knew who she was. This wasn't random, it was orchestrated. The coach hit something a rut perhaps, just the inevitable physics of taking a mountain curve too fast, and began to tip. Charlotte felt the sickening sensation of weightlessness as the world turned sideways, then upside down. Wood splintered and metal shrieked as the stage rolled down a rocky embankment, coming to rest with a final definitive crash. Pain bloomed across Charlotte's left shoulder as she struggled to untangle herself from the wreckage. Blood ran down her face from a cut above her eyebrow, and her hands shook as she pushed away broken planks and torn fabric. The merchant was unconscious beside her, breathing, but clearly hurt. The driver was nowhere to be seen. Then she heard boots crunching through the debris and a rough voice saying, "Check for survivors. Hanlon wants to know if that Whitmore girl made it through alive." Charlotte forced herself to remain perfectly still as a shadow fell across her face. She could smell tobacco and whiskey on someone's breath as they leaned down to examine her. "This one's breathing," the man called out. "Pretty little thing, too. Shame we can't—" The voice cut off with a wet gurgle, replaced by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Charlotte opened her eyes just enough to see moccasined feet stepping carefully through the wreckage, and her heart began to pound for an entirely different reason. The man standing over her was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. Tall and lean with copper skin and long black hair bound with leather strips, he moved with the fluid grace of a natural predator. Buckskin clothing and traditional beadwork marked him as one of the Plains tribes, while the Winchester rifle in his hands and the scalping knife at his belt spoke of skills honed by a lifetime of survival in hostile territory. Most unsettling of all were his eyes, dark as winter night, but burning with an intelligence and fury that made Charlotte understand why her people spoke of the Indian problem in hushed, fearful tones. The warrior crouched beside her without taking his gaze from the surrounding rocks, where the surviving bandits had taken cover. When he spoke, his English was clear and precise, with only the slightest accent to betray that it was not his first language. Can you walk? Charlotte tried to speak and found her voice had abandoned her entirely. She managed a small nod instead, though she wasn't entirely certain it was true. Then we leave now, he said, helping her to her feet with surprising gentleness. More will come soon. As if to emphasize his point, a rifle cracked from somewhere above them, and the warrior pulled Charlotte behind the overturned coach as the bullet sparked off a nearby rock. She could hear shouts as the remaining bandits tried to coordinate their attack, but they sounded nervous now, uncertain. Who are you? Charlotte whispered, finding her voice at last. My name is Lakota, he replied, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. And right now, I am the only thing standing between you and a very unpleasant death. Another shot rang out closer this time, and Lakota returned fire with deadly accuracy. Charlotte heard a scream from the rocks above, then the sound of a body tumbling down the slope. Stay close to me, Lakota commanded, grabbing her wrist and pulling her away from the wreckage. Do exactly what I say when I say it, and you might live to see another sunrise. They ran through a landscape that seemed designed to kill the unwary, loose shale, that threatened to send them tumbling into canyons, thorny brush, that tore at their clothing, hidden crevices that could swallow a horse and rider without a trace. Charlotte's lungs burned as she struggled to keep pace with Dakota's ground-eating stride, her city-bred body protesting every jarring step. Behind them, the pursuit was relentless. She could hear horses crashing through the undergrowth, voices shouting directions, the occasional crack of a rifle, as someone caught sight of their fleeing forms. But Lakota seemed to know every rock and ravine in this desolate country, leading her through passages that would hide them from view while allowing them to hear the frustrated curses of their pursuers. This way, he hissed, pulling her into a narrow canyon that seemed to dead end against a wall of red sandstone. But as they approached what looked like solid rock, Charlotte saw that it was actually a cleverly concealed opening, just wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. The passage led to a hidden valley, no more than a few acres in size, with a small spring bubbling up from between tumbled boulders. Ancient pictographs covered the canyon walls, and Charlotte realized she was looking at a sacred place somewhere that had been used by Dakota's people for generations. We rest here, he said, settling against a sun-warmed rock and beginning to examine the various cuts and bruises he had sustained during their escape. They will not find us before dark, and in darkness we have the advantage. Charlotte sank to the ground beside the spring, her legs finally giving out entirely. Now that the immediate danger had passed, she was beginning to understand just how drastically her life had changed in the space of a few hours. Why did you help me? She asked, using her torn petticoat to clean the blood from her face. Lakota was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her squirm. The men who attacked your coach, he said finally. They were not ordinary bandits. How do you know? Because I have been hunting them for 3 weeks. His voice carried a coldness that made Charlotte shiver despite the warm afternoon sun. They raided my people's winter camp, killed 6 warriors, including my younger brother, and stole sacred items that cannot be replaced. Charlotte felt her stomach clench with a growing sense of dread. The letter in her reticule seemed to burn against her hip. You think the same men who attacked your people were hired to kidnap me? I do not think I know. Lakota reached into his buckskin shirt and withdrew a brass-button military issue and polished to a mirror shine. This came from the coat of the man who led the raid on our camp. The same man who commanded the attack on your stagecoach. Charlotte stared at the button, her mind racing. She had seen buttons exactly like this before on the uniform of her father's head of security. Calvin Dorsey, she whispered. You know him. He works for my father. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. But that would mean... She couldn't finish the thought. It was too monstrous to contemplate. That your father ordered the attack on my people to clear them from land he wanted for his railroad," Dakota said quietly. "And now he has ordered you kidnapped, perhaps, to prevent you from speaking about something you have seen or heard." Charlotte's hand moved instinctively to her reticule where the letter lay hidden. She remembered other fragments, now overheard conversations between her father and his associates, references to clearing obstacles and removing impediments to progress. At the time, she had assumed they were talking about legal challenges or political opposition. But what if they had meant something far more sinister? "Oh God," she breathed. "What if he didn't want me married to create a political alliance? What if he wanted me under someone else's control because I know too much?" "What do you know?" Dakota asked, his voice sharp with interest. Charlotte hesitated, then pulled out the crumpled letter. "I found this in my father's study. I thought it was just business correspondence, but now—" She handed it to Dakota, who read it carefully despite the fading light. "This speaks of eliminating resistance and permanent solutions to the native problem," he said grimly. "Combined with what happened to my people, it paints a clear picture. They spent the rest of the day in the hidden valley, while Dakota shared his knowledge of survival in the wilderness. He showed Charlotte which plants could be eaten safely and which would kill her, how to find water in country that looked barren, how to move without leaving tracks that could be followed. The bow is a tool of precision," he explained, demonstrating the proper grip. "It requires patience, discipline, and understanding of your prey. Hold it like this, firm but not rigid. The arrow must become an extension of your intent." Charlotte's first few attempts were disasters, arrows flying wildly in every direction except toward the target Dakota had set up. But gradually, with patient coaching, she began to understand the relationship between breath aim and release. "Your hands shake too much," Dakota observed after her fifth attempt. "You think too much about the target and not enough about the process. In my culture, we say the arrow knows its own path. You must simply give it permission to fly." "That's quite philosophical for weapons training," Charlotte said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "All warfare is philosophical." Dakota replied seriously. "The warrior who understands only weapons will be defeated by the warrior who understands the spirit behind the weapons." "Is that how you learned to fight philosophy?" "I learned to fight because the alternative was death. But I learned to survive because my grandfather taught me to think like the land itself, patient, enduring, always adapting." Dakota began preparing a small fire as the sun sank toward the western mountains. "Your people build walls against the wilderness. Mine learned to become part of it." That evening, as they shared a meal of dried meat and wild roots, Charlotte found herself studying her unlikely protector with growing fascination. Everything about him spoke of strength and competence. But there was also a thoughtfulness that surprised her. "Tell me about your brother," she said softly. Dakota's hands stilled on the piece of wood he was carving into an arrow shaft. For a moment, Charlotte thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice carefully controlled, but unable to hide the pain beneath the words. "His name was Ayanna. It means eternal blossom in our language. He was 16, just becoming a man. He wanted to be a great warrior like our grandfather, but he was too gentle for war. He preferred making things with his hands, bows, arrows, beautiful beadwork that the women praised." "What happened to him?" "Dorsey's men came at dawn when most of our warriors were away hunting. They burned our lodges, killed anyone who tried to resist, and took the sacred bundle that has guided our people for 7 generations." Dakota's knuckles whitened as his grip tightened on the arrow shaft. "Ayanna tried to protect the children. They shot him down like a dog and left his body for the wolves." Charlotte felt tears stinging her eyes as she imagined the scene, a peaceful camp shattered by violence. A young man dying to protect those weaker than himself. The guilt was almost overwhelming as she realized that her father's greed had been the ultimate cause of Ayana's death. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so very sorry. Your sorrow will not bring him back." Lakota replied, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Only justice can give his spirit rest." "Then we'll get him justice," Charlotte said with sudden, fierce determination. "We'll make them pay for what they've done." Lakota looked at her with surprise. "You would stand against your own father. If he's responsible for murder and theft, then he's not the father I thought I knew," Charlotte replied. "Some things are more important than family loyalty." They spent 3 more days in the Hidden Valley, while Charlotte's injuries healed and her skills slowly improved. Lakota was a demanding teacher, pushing her to master essential survival techniques that might mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. "Fire is life out here," he explained as he showed her how to start a flame using flint and steel. "Without it, you freeze at night. You cannot cook food safely. You have no way to signal for help or defend yourself against predators." Charlotte's first attempts produced nothing but sparks and frustration. Her soft hands, accustomed to nothing more strenuous than needlework, were soon blistered and bleeding from the rough steel and flint. "I can't do this," she said after her 10th failed attempt. "My hands aren't made for this kind of work." "Your hands are made for whatever you demand of them," Lakota replied without sympathy. "Weakness is a choice, not a condition. Try again." Charlotte gritted her teeth and struck the flint again. This time, a tiny spark caught in the tinder, and she quickly blew it into a small flame. The sense of accomplishment was surprisingly satisfying. "No better," Lakota acknowledged. "But you still think like a woman of comfort instead of a woman of the wilderness. Out here, comfort is earned through competence. Water is even more important than fire." He continued the next day, leading her to examine various plants and rock formations. "You can live for days without food, but only hours without water in this climate. Learn to read the signs, green vegetation following underground streams, animal trails that lead to water sources, the flight patterns of birds in the evening as they return to roost near water." By the 4th day, Charlotte could track a rabbit's path through dense brush, identify edible roots and berries, and shoot her makeshift bow with reasonable accuracy. Her hands were blistered and her muscles ached constantly, but she was beginning to understand the difference between surviving and truly living in this harsh landscape. "We leave at dawn," Lakota announced that evening as they prepared to sleep. "Dorsey's men will have given up searching this immediate area, but they will be watching the roads and towns. We must reach Fort Collins before they realize we are still alive." "Why Fort Collins?" "Because that is where the territorial judge holds court, and Judge Morrison is one of the few officials your father has not yet bought." Dakota's expression was grim as he checked his weapons. "If we can present evidence of the illegal land seizures and the attack on my people, perhaps justice can still be done." Charlotte nodded, though privately she wondered if they would live long enough to reach any courthouse. Her father had resources that extended far beyond a few hired gunmen, and she was beginning to understand that he would not hesitate to use them if he felt threatened. They left the valley before sunrise, moving carefully through country that seemed determined to kill them. The terrain was unforgiving rocky hills, covered with thorny brush, deep canyons that forced lengthy detours, stretches of open ground, where they would be visible to watchers on the surrounding heights. By midday, they had reached the ruins of Cinder Bluff, an abandoned mining town that had boomed and busted in the space of 5 years. Weathered buildings lined what had once been a main street, their windows dark and empty as dead eyes. The wind moaned through broken timbers and collapsed roofs, creating an atmosphere of desolation that made Charlotte shiver despite the warm sun. "We rest here," Lakota decided, leading Charlotte toward what had been the town's saloon. but carefully. Places like this attract scavengers of all kinds. The interior of the saloon was a disaster of broken furniture and shattered glass. Faded paintings of scantily clad women peered down from walls stained with water damage and what might have been old blood. The air smelled of dust and decay, with an underlying odor of something Charlotte preferred not to identify. Why did they abandon this place? She asked, settling against a wall that still retained some of its paint. Silver played out sooner than expected. Lakota replied, taking up a position by the window where he could watch the street. Or perhaps the mine was never as rich as the investors were told. There are many ways for a town to die in this country. Charlotte thought about her father's railroad empire, built on promises of connecting mining towns and cattle ranches to eastern markets. How many of those promises were based on real opportunities, and how many were simply elaborate schemes to separate investors from their money? Lakota, she said as he continued his vigilant watch. What will happen to you after we testify? I mean, won't you be in danger for helping me? He was quiet for a moment, his attention apparently focused on the empty street outside. My people have a saying, he said finally. A man who seeks justice must be prepared to die for it. Ayana's spirit will not rest until his killers are punished. But surely there's more to life than revenge. Charlotte protested. What about rebuilding your community? What about having a family of your own? How can I think of building new life when I have not yet properly honored the life that was taken? Lakota's voice carried a weight of grief that made Charlotte's heart ache. Until I have justice for my brother, I am not truly alive myself. I am merely existing. Before Charlotte could respond, Lakota suddenly tensed like a hunting cat. Someone comes, he whispered, his hand moving to his rifle. Multiple riders trying to move quietly, but not succeeding. Charlotte pressed herself against the wall as she heard the soft sound of horses moving through the ruins. Whoever was out there was good. She could barely detect their approach, despite Lakota's warning. How many, she breathed? At least 6, maybe more. Lakota eased toward the door with his rifle ready. They're surrounding the building. Professional work. Stay down. He added, his voice barely audible. If shooting starts, make your way to that hole in the back wall and run. Do not wait for me, just run and keep running until you reach the river. The first man through the saloon's batwing doors was Calvin Dorsey himself, a thick-set individual with graying hair and the coldest blue eyes Charlotte had ever seen. He wore the dark suit of a businessman, but the gun on his hip and the way he moved marked him as someone intimately familiar with violence. Miss Whitmore, he said pleasantly, as if encountering her in her father's parlor rather than a ruined saloon in the middle of nowhere. Your father has been quite worried about you. Worried enough to have me kidnapped. Charlotte replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Dorsey's smile was thin and entirely without warmth. Worried enough to ensure that you don't do anything that might damage the family's interests. You saw something in his study, didn't you? Something that a young lady of your breeding should not concern herself with. Charlotte felt the letter in her reticule like a burning coal against her hip. You mean the evidence of bribery and illegal land seizures? The proof that he's been stealing territory from the tribes and paying government officials to look the other way. Such harsh words, Dorsey said, stepping further into the room. Charlotte became aware that more men were filing in behind him, hard-faced individuals with the look of professional killers. She counted at least 6, all armed and alert. Your father prefers to think of it as aggressive business practices. Dorsey continued conversationally. The frontier demands certain compromises that more civilized regions would not understand. Progress requires sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice is made by those too primitive to appreciate its necessity. Like the children your men murdered in that Cheyenne camp. Charlotte shot back anger overriding her fear. "Regrettable casualties," Dorsey said with a shrug. "But unavoidable if the greater good is to be served. The railroad will bring civilization to this territory, Miss Whitmore. Thousands of jobs, new towns' opportunities for growth and prosperity. Surely a few savage lives are a small price to pay for such benefits. Where's the Indian?" Dorsey asked, his tone becoming sharper. "Don't tell me you've been surviving in the wilderness all by yourself. That would be quite remarkable for a pampered Boston socialite." "He's gone." Charlotte lied, hoping her voice didn't betray her terror. "He left me here and rode north to rejoin his people." "How unfortunate. I was looking forward to thanking him personally for the trouble he's caused us." Dorsey's hand rested casually on his gun butt. "You see, that savage has been quite the nuisance, tracking us across half the territory, like some kind of avenging spirit. It will be a relief to eliminate him." That's when Lakota struck. He came through the back window, like death itself, his rifle speaking twice, before he hit the floor in a roll that carried him behind the bar. Two of Dorsey's men went down immediately, clutching wounds that would prove fatal within minutes. The precision of the attack was breathtaking, each shot placed with surgical accuracy, to disable rather than kill, outright leaving the wounded men screaming and disrupting the coordination of their companions. The saloon erupted in chaos as the surviving gunmen tried to return fire while taking cover behind overturned tables and broken chairs. Splinters flew as bullets chewed through the old wood, and the air filled with gun smoke and shouted curses. The acoustics of the enclosed space made every shot sound like thunder, and Charlotte found herself deafened by the cacophony of violence. Charlotte pressed herself flat against the floor as lead flew overhead, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was nothing like the romanticized gunfights she had read about in dime novels. This was savage, desperate, and terrifyingly real. Men were dying around her, their blood pooling on the dusty floor, and she could do nothing but try to make herself as small a target as possible. Lakota's rifle cracked again from behind the bar, and another gunman spun away with a scream. But Charlotte could see that he was trapped with limited ammunition, while Dorsey's men were beginning to coordinate their attack. They had positioned themselves to create crossfire, and it was only a matter of time before their superior numbers told. "I give it up, savage." Dorsey called out, his voice carrying clearly over the gunfire. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, and I'll make it quick for both of you." Lakota's response was another perfectly placed shot that sent splinters flying from the post where Dorsey had taken cover. But Charlotte could see blood on the warrior's shirt. He had been hit, though he was hiding the extent of his injuries with typical stoicism. "We need to create a distraction," she called out during a brief lull in the firing. "Something to break up their positions." "What do you suggest?" Lakota replied, his voice strained with pain and effort. Charlotte looked around desperately, her mind racing. The saloon was full of debris and broken furniture, but nothing that seemed immediately useful as a weapon. Then she noticed the overturned oil lamps scattered around the room, their contents soaking into the dry wooden floor. "Can you give me covering fire?" she asked. "For what?" "Something incredibly stupid," Charlotte admitted. "But it might work." Before Lakota could object, Charlotte began crawling toward the nearest lamp, keeping low as bullets whistled overhead. Her plan was desperate and dangerous, but it was better than simply waiting to be overwhelmed by superior numbers. The broken bottle was within reach, its jagged edges sharp enough to cut deeply. But instead of using it as a weapon, Charlotte began using it to scrape together oil-soaked debris and broken glass, creating an improvised incendiary device. One of Dorsey's men, a thin individual with nervous eyes, who was too focused on Lakota's position to notice her movements, had taken cover behind an overturned table barely 10 feet away. Charlotte pulled out the matches Lakota had given her for emergency fire starting and lit the oil-soaked rag she had torn from her petticoat. The improvised firebomb arced through the air and exploded against the table in a shower of flames and broken glass, The gunman screamed as his clothing caught fire, and his wild attempts to extinguish himself disrupted the entire left flank of Dorsey's attack. "Now," Charlotte shouted. Dakota rose from behind the bar like an avenging spirit, his rifle picking off targets with mechanical precision as the gunmen tried to reorganize their positions. Charlotte grabbed the fallen man's rifle and added her own fire to the battle. Her shots wild but effective enough to keep the surviving attackers pinned down. The tide of battle turned in seconds. What had been a coordinated attack became a rout as Dorsey's men realized they were facing opponents who refused to die quietly. 2 more gunmen went down under Dakota's accurate fire, and the rest began looking for ways to escape the burning building. "It's over, Dorsey," Charlotte said, keeping her rifle trained on her father's security chief as smoke began to fill the saloon. "We have evidence of what you've done, and now we have witnesses." Dorsey laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the ruined saloon. "Evidence? What evidence?" "A few business documents that could mean anything. The word of a savage and a hysterical girl against respected businessmen. The sacred bundle you stole from Dakota's people," Charlotte replied. "The one that proves your men raided their camp. Plus the confession letter from one of your own men detailing the entire operation." For the first time, Dorsey's composure cracked. "What confession?" Charlotte reached into her reticule and withdrew a second letter, one she had found hidden with her father's correspondence, but hadn't mentioned to Dakota. "Frank Morrison's last letter to my father," she said, reading from the paper. "The Indian situation has been permanently resolved as requested. 6 confirmed dead, including the young brave who tried to protect the children. The sacred items have been secured and are ready for transport to the buyer you specified." Dakota's eyes widened as he heard this. "There was a buyer. Someone purchased our sacred bundle." "Apparently so," Charlotte replied grimly. "Along with artifacts from at least 3 other tribes, according to this letter. It seems my father has been funding a systematic campaign of theft and murder to supply private collectors back east." Dorsey's face had gone pale as Charlotte read from the letter. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he snarled. "This goes far beyond your father's railroad. There are people involved in this who make Theodore Whitmore look like a small-town merchant. They will not allow decades of planning to be disrupted by a pampered brat and her pet savage." "Then those people should have found legal ways to acquire what they wanted," Charlotte replied. That's when she heard the sound of more horses approaching Cinder Bluff at a gallop. Dorsey's backup had arrived, and from the sound of it, there were at least a dozen riders. "Run," Dakota said urgently, grabbing Charlotte's arm and pulling her toward the back of the saloon. "We cannot fight them all." They burst through the rear door, just as armed riders began surrounding the building. Charlotte could hear Dorsey shouting orders coordinating what would surely be a systematic search of the entire town. The flames from their improvised firebomb were already spreading to other parts of the saloon, and soon the whole structure would be ablaze. "This way," Dakota whispered, leading her through a maze of collapsed buildings and abandoned mine shafts. His wound was clearly bothering him more than he wanted to admit, but he moved with the same fluid grace that had marked all his actions. The next few hours became a nightmarish game of cat and mouse through the ruins of Cinder Bluff. Dorsey's reinforcements had brought tracker dogs, and Charlotte could hear them baying in the distance as they followed scent trails through the debris-strewn streets. "They're hurting us," Dakota observed as they crouched behind the ruins of what had been the town's general store. "Driving us toward the canyon entrance, where they can trap us." "Is there another way out?" "Yes, but it is dangerous. The old mine workings connect to a series of natural caves that lead to the river canyon. But many of the tunnels have collapsed, and some are filled with poisonous gases from the mining operations." Charlotte looked at the systematic search pattern being conducted by their pursuers and made her decision. Dangerous is better than impossible. "Show me," They made their way to the entrance of the main mine shaft, a black hole in the hillside that seemed to swallow light itself. The air that drifted out smelled of sulfur and decay, and Charlotte could hear water dripping somewhere in the depths. "Stay close," Dakota warned as they descended into the darkness. Some of these passages drop away into pits that have no bottom. Others are filled with bad air that will kill you in seconds. The mine was a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers, all carved from the living rock by men desperate for silver that may never have existed in paying quantities. Their single torch cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating the illusion that the very stone was alive and moving around them. "Here," Dakota said, indicating a passage that branched off from the main tunnel. "This leads to the natural cave system. The air should be better there." They had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when they heard the first sounds of pursuit echoing through the tunnels behind them. Dorsey's men had found the mine entrance and were following their trail into the depths. "How much farther?" Charlotte whispered, trying to control her growing claustrophobia. "Not far." Dakota replied, though she could hear uncertainty in his voice. "The river should be just ahead." The sound of running water reached them before they saw it, and the North Platte River flowing swift and cold through a gorge that cut deep into the prairie. The underground passage opened onto a narrow beach of sand and rounded stones with steep canyon walls rising on both sides. But their relief at reaching the river was short-lived. The sound of men moving through the passage behind them was growing louder, and Charlotte could see the flickering glow of torches reflecting off the tunnel walls. "Now what?" Charlotte asked, looking at the rushing water with growing alarm. "We can't swim across that. It's too fast, too cold, and too deep." "We do not swim across," Dakota said, pointing downstream to where the canyon made a sharp bend. "We go with the current. Let it carry us away from here." Charlotte stared at the river in horror. The water was moving like a mill race full of submerged rocks and swirling eddies that could trap and drown the unwary. It was suicide. "There has to be another way," she protested. "There is no other way," Dakota replied, already moving toward the water's edge despite his wounds. "Listen." Charlotte strained her ears and heard what had alarmed him, and the sound of men moving through the passage behind them, their voices growing clearer as they approached the river beach. Dorsey's search had found their trail. "I can't swim in that," Charlotte said, her voice edged with panic. "I'll drown for certain." "Then we drown together," Dakota replied, taking her hand in his. "But we do not surrender to men like Dorsey." The first gunshot echoed through the passage. As Dorsey's men reached the final chamber, there was no more time for debate or fear. Charlotte and Dakota hit the water together, the shock of the cold driving the breath from their lungs. The current grabbed them immediately, dragging them away from the beach and into the main channel where the water ran deepest and fastest. Charlotte fought to keep her head above the surface as the river carried them through rapids that seemed designed to dash them against the rocks. Her heavy clothing dragged at her limbs like lead weights, and the frigid water quickly began sapping her strength and coordination. Beside her, Dakota was struggling even more desperately. His wounds were bleeding freely, turning the water around him pink, and Charlotte could see that he was having trouble staying conscious. The combination of blood loss and cold water was proving nearly fatal. "Hold on," she shouted over the roar of the water, grabbing his arm as he began to slip beneath the surface. They were swept around the bend and into a stretch of calmer water. But Charlotte could see white foam ahead that marked another set of rapids larger and more dangerous than the ones they had just survived. She looked desperately for any way to get to shore. But the canyon walls rose straight up from the water's edge, offering no handholds or beaches. That's when she saw it, a fallen tree spanning the river like a bridge, its branches trailing in the current, like grasping fingers. If they could grab hold of it. "There," she shouted, pointing toward their only hope. Dakota saw it too and began swimming weakly toward the makeshift bridge. Charlotte stayed beside him, using her remaining strength to help keep him afloat, as the current carried them closer to their target. The tree was larger than she had initially thought, a massive pine that had probably been undermined by spring floods and toppled across the narrow canyon. The impact nearly knocked her unconscious. Charlotte slammed into the submerged branches of the fallen tree, the rough bark scraping her face and hands raw. But she managed to get a grip on one of the larger limbs, and somehow she hauled both herself and the semi-conscious Dakota out of the main current. They hung there for several minutes, gasping and shivering before Charlotte found the strength to work her way along the tree toward the canyon wall. There, hidden behind a curtain of hanging willow branches, was a small cave carved by centuries of spring floods. Getting Dakota into the shelter nearly finished her. The warrior was barely conscious, his face gray with blood loss and shock. Charlotte used strips torn from her ruined dress to bind his wounds as best she could, but she knew he needed real medical attention soon. "We made it," she whispered, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. "We actually made it." They had escaped Dorsey's immediate pursuit, but Charlotte knew their situation was still desperate. They were miles from civilization, with no supplies, no weapons, and no way to travel quickly with Dakota in his current condition. The cave provided shelter from the elements, but it was also a trap. If Dorsey's men found them here, there would be no escape. But they were alive, and they still had the evidence that would prove Dorsey's crimes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to build hope on. As night fell over the canyon, Charlotte sat beside the unconscious warrior and tried to plan their next move. They needed to reach Fort Collins and the territorial judge, but first they had to survive long enough to make the journey. She thought about her life in Boston, about the comfortable cage she had been so desperate to escape. That world seemed impossibly distant now, as remote as the moon. She was no longer the pampered daughter of a railroad magnate. She was something new, something forged by hardship and danger, and the example of a Cheyenne warrior who had taught her the true meaning of courage. The next morning brought both hope and renewed danger. Dakota's fever had broken during the night, and though he was still weak, he was conscious and alert. More importantly, Charlotte could hear the distant sound of a steamboat whistle echoing through the canyon. River traffic. Dakota said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If we can signal them." Charlotte looked at their meager supplies and tried to think of a way to attract attention from passing boats. The cave was hidden behind willow branches, invisible from the main channel. They would have to get back to the water's edge and hope that someone would see them before Dorsey's men tracked them down. "Can you travel?" she asked. Dakota struggled to sit up, his face contorting with pain. "I can try." They made their way carefully back to the riverbank, using the willow branches for concealment. The steamboat was still some distance upstream, but Charlotte could see the smoke from its stack growing larger. "Here," she said, gathering dried brush and the few matches that had somehow stayed dry in Dakota's leather pouch. "We'll build a signal fire." The fire caught quickly in the dried tinder, sending a column of smoke rising into the still morning air. Charlotte fed it with everything she could find: deadwood, dried grass, even some of the fabric from her ruined traveling dress. The steamboat rounded the bend. Just as the fire reached its peak, a side-wheeler named the Prairie Belle, with a cargo of freight and passengers bound for Denver. Charlotte waved frantically, shouting at the top of her lungs, despite knowing they couldn't hear her over the sound of the paddle wheel. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed as though the boat would pass them by. Then she saw figures on the deck pointing toward their fire, and the captain began steering toward the shore. "Thank God." Charlotte breathed, helping Dakota to his feet as the steamboat approached. The Prairie Belle's captain was a grizzled riverman named Morrison, who had been running freight on the western waterways for 20 years. He took one look at Charlotte's condition and Dakota's wounds, and asked no questions, simply ordering his crew to get them aboard and make them comfortable. "Or where you folks headed?" he asked as his wife tended to Dakota's injuries. "Fort Collins," Charlotte replied. "It's urgent that we reach the territorial judge." Morrison studied her face for a moment, clearly trying to decide if she was a runaway or something more complicated. "That's a day's journey downriver, then another day overland," he said finally. "But I can get you as far as Greeley. You'll have to find other transportation from there." Charlotte nodded gratefully. It wasn't perfect, but it was far better than trying to walk across the prairie with a wounded man. As the Prairie Belle resumed its downstream journey, Charlotte found herself standing at the rail watching the canyon walls slide past. Somewhere behind them, Dorsey and his men were probably still searching for their bodies. Let them look, she thought grimly. By the time they realized their prey had escaped, it would be too late. "You did well back there," Dakota said quietly, appearing beside her at the rail. He was still pale and moved carefully, but his eyes had regained their fierce intelligence. "I had a good teacher," Charlotte replied. "There is something else you should know." Dakota said, his voice becoming more serious. "The letter you found, the one about selling sacred artifacts to collectors. I have heard rumors of such things among my people. There is a man in Chicago who specializes in acquiring Indian artifacts for wealthy buyers back east. If your father has been supplying him, then this is bigger than just one railroad company's land grab." Charlotte finished. "It's an organized campaign of cultural theft." "Exactly. And if we can prove that connection, we might be able to bring down not just your father and Dorsey, but an entire network of criminals." They traveled the rest of the day in comparative comfort, sharing meals with the other passengers and trying to plan their next moves. The evidence they carried seemed to grow heavier with each mile weighted down by the lives that had been lost to protect it. As evening approached and the lights of Greeley came into view, Charlotte felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They were close to safety now, but also close to a reckoning that would determine not just their fates, but the future of relations between white settlers and the native tribes of the territory. The town of Greeley was a testament to frontier optimism. Neat streets laid out in a grid, well-built houses with actual glass windows, and even a small hotel that looked almost civilized. The territorial judge, Captain Morrison, informed them held court there twice a month, and they were in luck. His next session was scheduled to begin the following morning. Charlotte used some of the money she had managed to save from her Boston escape fund to rent rooms at the hotel and buy clean clothes for both of them. It felt strange to be worrying about appearances again after days of simply trying to survive. But she understood the importance of making a good impression on the judge. That evening, as they prepared for what might be their only chance at justice, Charlotte found herself thinking about her father. Theodore Whitmore was a powerful man with connections throughout the territorial government. Would Judge Morrison be willing to stand up to that kind of pressure? Would he even listen to accusations against such a prominent businessman? "You are worried," Dakota observed as they sat in the hotel's small dining room. "Terrified," Charlotte admitted. "What if he doesn't believe us? What if my father's influence reaches even here?" "Then we will have tried," Dakota replied. "Sometimes that is all honor requires." Charlotte looked at the warrior who had become so much more than her protector during their journey together. "What will you do afterward? I mean, assuming we survive this nonsense?" "Return to my people," Dakota said simply. "Help them find new ways to live in a world that is changing whether we like it or not. And if they don't accept those changes," Dakota was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the darkening street, "then they will die, as the old ways die, and there will be nothing left but memories and regrets." That night, Charlotte lay awake in her hotel bed, the first real bed she had slept in since fleeing Boston, and tried to prepare herself for what was to come. Tomorrow would determine whether their desperate flight had been worth the cost, whether Ayanna's death would be avenged, whether justice still existed in a territory dominated by men like her father. She thought about the girl who had boarded that stagecoach in Laramie just a week ago, running from an arranged marriage and dreaming of freedom. That girl had been naive, sheltered, utterly unprepared for the realities of life beyond her comfortable cage. The woman lying in this hotel bed was different. She had killed men in battle, had risked her life for a cause larger than herself, had learned that courage came not from the absence of fear, but from acting in spite of it. The transformation had been painful, but she wouldn't trade it for anything. Morning brought rain and the sound of wagons in the street as Greeley prepared for another day of commerce and growth. Charlotte dressed carefully in the new clothes she had purchased, a simple but respectable dress that would mark her as a lady, without flaunting wealth that might raise uncomfortable questions. Dakota had also cleaned up, though he had refused to abandon his traditional clothing entirely. He wore a mix of Cheyenne and white man's clothing that somehow managed to look both dignified and slightly dangerous, exactly the impression Charlotte hoped he would make on the judge. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building that served multiple functions: courtroom, land office, and meeting hall for various territorial commissions. Judge Morrison was already in session when they arrived, hearing a dispute between 2 ranchers over water rights. Charlotte studied the man who held their fate in his hands. Morrison was perhaps 50 years old, with gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His reputation was that of a fair but tough judge who couldn't be bought or intimidated, exactly what they needed if the reputation was accurate. When their case was called, Charlotte felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she and Dakota approached the bench. Behind them, she noticed several other people had entered the courtroom, men in expensive suits who had the look of lawyers or business representatives. "State your business," Judge Morrison said without preamble. Charlotte took a deep breath and began to tell their story. She spoke carefully and precisely, laying out the chain of events that had led them to this courtroom: the attack on the stagecoach, the revelation about Dorsey's crimes, the evidence they had gathered during their desperate flight. When she finished, the judge studied her for a long moment before turning to Dakota. "And you, sir, do you corroborate this account?" "I do," Dakota replied in his careful English. "And I have evidence to support our claims." He produced the sacred bundle from his pack, unwrapping it carefully to reveal not just the religious artifacts inside, but also documents that had been hidden within the leather wrapping: contracts, payment records, and correspondence that detailed not just the illegal land seizures, but the entire network of artifact theft that stretched from the Wyoming Territory to private collectors in New York and Boston. Judge Morrison examined the papers with growing interest, his expression becoming grimmer with each page. "These are serious accusations," he said finally. "If proven true, they would constitute violations of federal law regarding treaties with the Indian tribes, as well as interstate commerce violations and conspiracy charges." That's when one of the men in expensive suits stood up. "Your Honor, I represent the interests of Theodore Whitmore and the Union Mountain Railroad. My client categorically denies these allegations and suggests that his daughter has been coerced into making false statements by her Indian captor." Charlotte felt her cheeks burn with anger. "I haven't been coerced into anything. I'm testifying of my own free will about crimes I witnessed personally." "Miss Whitmore," the lawyer continued smoothly, "surely you understand the strain you've been under. A traumatic experience like being kidnapped can affect one's judgment, can create false memories of events that never occurred. My memories are perfectly clear." Charlotte interrupted. "I saw the documents in my father's study. I know what Calvin Dorsey did to Dakota's people. And I know that you're here to try to cover it up." Judge Morrison rapped his gavel sharply. "That's enough. Mr. Henderson, your client will have ample opportunity to defend himself once formal charges are filed. For now, I'm more interested in the evidence than in legal maneuvering." But Henderson wasn't finished. "Your Honor, I have here a telegram from Miss Whitmore's physician in Boston stating that she has been under treatment for nervous exhaustion and hysteria. Surely the court cannot give credence to the fantasies of a mentally unstable young woman who has clearly been manipulated by hostile savages." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. She had never been treated for any such condition, but she realized with growing horror that her father had probably arranged for false medical records to be created just in case he ever needed to discredit her testimony. "That's a lie," she said, but she could hear how weak her voice sounded. "Is it?" Henderson pressed. "Then perhaps Miss Whitmore can explain why she fled her family home in the middle of the night, abandoning a respectable engagement to a prominent senator's son. Such behavior hardly suggests mental stability." Judge Morrison leaned forward, his expression stern. "Miss Whitmore, can you provide any corroboration for your claims beyond your own testimony and that of your Indian companion?" Charlotte felt panic rising in her throat. Without independent witnesses or documentary evidence that couldn't be dismissed as fabricated, their entire case was falling apart. That's when Lakota stepped forward. "Your Honor, may I speak?" "You may. There is another witness to these events. A man named Frank Morrison, not related to Your Honor, but rather one of Dorsey's lieutenants who participated in the raid on my village." Lakota reached into his pack and withdrew a small leather journal. "This is his personal diary, which I recovered from his body after our fight in Cinder Bluff. It contains detailed accounts of multiple raids, including the names of tribal leaders killed and the specific artifacts stolen." Henderson looked stricken. "Your Honor, surely the court cannot accept evidence obtained through violence." "I can and I will," Judge Morrison said firmly, taking the journal from Lakota's hands. "If this document proves authentic, it would constitute direct evidence of criminal conspiracy." As the judge read from Morrison's diary, his expression grew darker. The entries were detailed and damning, describing not just the raid on Lakota's village, but similar attacks on at least 6 other tribal communities. More importantly, they named specific buyers for the stolen artifacts and listed payments received for various items. "Mr. Henderson," Judge Morrison said when he finished reading, "I suggest you wire your client immediately. These charges are far more serious than simple land disputes." But Henderson had gone pale as the implications sank in. "Your Honor, I request a recess to consult with my client." "Denied. This court will proceed with the evidence as presented." The hearing continued for most of the morning, with Lakota providing detailed testimony about the attack on his village, and Charlotte describing what she had seen in her father's private papers. The sacred bundle and Morrison's diary were entered into evidence, along with statements from Captain Morrison of the Prairie Belle and other witnesses who could confirm parts of their story. When it was over, Judge Morrison announced that he would need time to study the evidence before making his decision. In the meantime, he was issuing warrants for the arrest of Calvin Dorsey and his known associates, as well as a federal marshal's warrant for Theodore Whitmore. "What about the artifact buyers?" Charlotte asked as they left the courthouse. "That will require federal investigators," the judge replied carefully. "This case appears to involve interstate commerce violations that fall under federal jurisdiction. I'm referring the entire matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver." That afternoon, Charlotte and Lakota waited in the hotel while word of the hearing spread through the territorial telegraph system. Charlotte knew that by evening her father would be aware of what had happened, and she tried not to think about his reaction. "You did well in there," Lakota said as they sat in the hotel's small lobby. "Your words carried weight with the judge. Do you think it will be enough?" "I think we have planted seeds of justice. Whether they grow depends on forces beyond our control." That evening brought news that sent a chill through Charlotte's heart. A telegram had arrived from Denver reporting that Calvin Dorsey and 3 of his men had been found dead in a hotel room, apparently killed in a gunfight with persons unknown. The territorial marshal was investigating, but no arrests had been made. "Your father moves quickly," Lakota observed when Charlotte showed him the telegram. "He's protecting himself," Charlotte replied grimly. "Dead men can't testify." But if Theodore Whitmore thought that eliminating Dorsey would end the investigation, he had seriously underestimated the federal government's interest in the case. The next morning brought U.S. Marshals from Denver, along with a team of federal investigators who had been tracking the artifact theft network for months. The lead investigator, a stern man named Wallace, interviewed Charlotte and Dakota, separately comparing their stories to information his office had already gathered from other sources. "We've been watching this operation for over a year," he admitted when the interviews were complete. "But we needed insider testimony to build a prosecutable case. Your father's activities have been part of a much larger conspiracy involving artifact theft, illegal land seizures, and murder for hire." "How large?" Charlotte asked. "At least 12 major collectors in eastern cities, connections to territorial officials in 4 different states, and a body count that we're still trying to calculate." Wallace's expression was grim. "Your testimony has given us the missing pieces we needed to bring down the entire network." The formal hearing was scheduled for the following week, with federal prosecutors arriving from Washington to handle the case. Charlotte spent the intervening days working with the lawyers, helping them understand the complex web of corruption and violence that her father had created. Dakota, meanwhile, had sent word to his people about what was happening. Charlotte wasn't sure what response he expected, but she hoped it would be peaceful. The last thing they needed was to give her father's allies an excuse to claim that the Cheyenne were the real threat to territorial security. The hearing itself was a media sensation, with reporters arriving from Denver, Chicago, and even New York to cover what the newspapers were calling the Western Artifact Conspiracy. Charlotte found herself uncomfortable with the attention, but she understood its importance. Public scrutiny would make it harder for powerful interests to influence the outcome. Her father arrived on the morning of the second day, stepping down from a private railroad car with an entourage of lawyers and bodyguards. Charlotte watched from the courthouse steps as Theodore Whitmore crossed the street, and she was struck by how much older he looked than when she had last seen him in Boston. Their eyes met briefly as he climbed the courthouse steps, and Charlotte saw something in his expression that might have been regret. But it was gone too quickly to be sure, replaced by the cold calculation of a businessman facing a threat to his empire. The confrontation she had been dreading came during the lunch recess, when her father cornered her in the courthouse corridor. "Charlotte," he said, his voice carrying the same authority that had shaped her childhood. "This has gone far enough. You're destroying everything I've worked for. I'm exposing what you've worked for." Charlotte replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "The question is whether you're proud of it. More proud." Theodore Whitmore's laugh was bitter. "Pride is a luxury I gave up long ago. I did what was necessary to build something lasting in this wilderness. The railroad will bring civilization to this territory, will create opportunities for thousands of people. That's worth a few moral compromises. Is it worth murder? Is it worth destroying entire communities for the sake of your stock prices?" Her father was quiet for a moment, and Charlotte could see the weight of his choices in the lines around his eyes. "I never intended for anyone to die," he said finally. "Dorsey was supposed to negotiate to find peaceful solutions. When he started using violence, you could have stopped him. You could have called off the whole operation." Charlotte felt tears threatening, but she fought them back. "Instead, you covered it up and tried to have me kidnapped to protect your secrets." "I was trying to protect you." Theodore's composure cracked for the first time. "You have no idea what men like Dorsey are capable of when they feel threatened. I thought if I could get you away from all this, send you somewhere safe until the investigation died down, you thought you could control me the way you control everything else. But I'm not a railroad or a mining claim, Father. I'm your daughter, and I deserved better than lies and arranged marriages and a life in a cage." When the hearing resumed, Charlotte watched her father take the witness stand with mixed emotions. Part of her still loved the man who had read her bedtime stories and taught her to play chess. But that man seemed very far away from the witness who invoked his Fifth Amendment rights to avoid answering most of the prosecutor's questions. The evidence was overwhelming. Document after document from Morrison's diary laid out the pattern of illegal land seizures, bribes to government officials, and the escalating violence that had culminated in the attack on Dakota's village. When combined with Dakota's testimony and the artifacts from the sacred bundle, it painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. But the prosecution's biggest surprise came on the final day of the hearing when they called a witness Charlotte hadn't expected to see: Frank Morrison's widow, Sarah. The woman was perhaps 40 years old, with the worn look of someone who had endured too much hardship. She walked to the witness stand with her head held high, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the courtroom. "My husband kept detailed records of everything he did," she said, looking directly at Theodore Whitmore. "He was proud of his work, proud of the money it brought in. But he was also afraid of what would happen if the truth ever came out." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a thick packet of letters. "These are correspondence between my husband and Mr. Whitmore, dating back 3 years. They discussed not just the tribal raids, but plans for eliminating government officials who asked too many questions and arrangements for disposing of witnesses who might testify against the operation." The prosecutor took the letters and began reading selected passages aloud. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed. Murder contracts, bribery schedules, and detailed plans for expanding the artifact theft operation to tribes throughout the Western Territories. "Why are you coming forward now?" the prosecutor asked. "Because my husband is dead, killed by the same people he served," Sarah Morrison replied. "And because I have 2 young sons who need to grow up in a world where justice still means something." Judge Morrison's ruling came 3 days later, and it exceeded Charlotte's most optimistic hopes. The federal prosecutors were authorized to bring formal charges against Theodore Whitmore and his remaining associates. The illegal land seizures were declared null and void, and reparations were ordered for all affected tribal communities. More importantly, the judge recommended that the case be referred to Congress as evidence of the need for stronger federal oversight of territorial development and protection of Indian rights. It was a complete victory for justice, though Charlotte knew the legal battles were far from over. That evening, as Charlotte sat in the hotel lobby reading newspaper accounts of the ruling, Dakota approached her with something in his hands. "I have something for you," he said, settling into the chair beside her. The object was a beaded bracelet, beautiful in its simplicity, with patterns that seemed to tell a story in colors and shapes. Charlotte turned it over in her hands, admiring the craftsmanship. "It belonged to my sister," Dakota explained. "She made it the summer before she died in the influenza epidemic 5 years ago. I have carried it ever since, waiting for the right person to give it to." Charlotte felt tears pricking her eyes as she understood the significance of the gift. "Dakota, I can't accept this. It's too important to you, which is why you must accept it," he replied gently. "It represents the bond between us, the friendship that grew from tragedy and hardship. My sister would have liked you, I think. You have her spirit, fierce and uncompromising, but also kind." Charlotte slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, feeling its weight like a benediction. "What happens now? I mean, where do we go from here?" "You must return to your world," Dakota said. "The prosecutors will need your testimony when the formal trials begin, and there will be congressional hearings that require your presence." "What about you?" "I return to my people to help them navigate this new world we have created together." Dakota smiled, and Charlotte realized it was the first time she had seen genuine happiness in his expression. "But I do not think this is goodbye forever. Our paths will cross again, I believe." The next morning brought the bittersweet ritual of parting. Charlotte would be taking the eastbound train to Denver, then on to Washington for the congressional hearings. Dakota would be riding north to rejoin his band and begin the difficult work of rebuilding their community. At the train station, Charlotte found herself struggling to find words for everything she wanted to say. How could she thank someone for saving not just her life, But her soul, how could she express what their friendship had meant to her? "You gave me something I didn't even know I was looking for," she said finally. "Freedom. Real freedom, not just escape from one cage to another. Nakastan, you gave me something I thought I had lost forever." Lakota replied, "Hope for the future, faith that people can change, that justice is still possible in this world." The train whistle blew, and Charlotte knew their time was up. On impulse, she reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a small leather journal, the one in which she had been recording her experiences during their flight across the territory. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing the journal into his hands. "It's the story of what we did, what we accomplished together. Maybe someday your grandchildren will read it and understand that their grandfather helped change history." Lakota accepted the journal, solemnly tucking it carefully into his pack. "And maybe someday your grandchildren will read about a pampered Boston socialite who found the courage to stand up to the most powerful men in America." The train was beginning to move as Charlotte climbed aboard, and she pressed her face to the window as Lakota stepped back onto the platform. He raised his hand in farewell, and she waved back until the station disappeared around a curve in the tracks. As the train gathered speed, carrying her toward an uncertain future, Charlotte touched the beaded bracelet on her wrist and thought about everything that had changed in her life. She was no longer running from something, she was running toward a future where she could use the lessons Lakota had taught her to make a real difference in the world. But first, there would be trials. Her father was eventually convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His railroad empire collapsed, its assets seized to pay reparations to the affected communities. The artifact theft network was dismantled with prosecutions extending from Wyoming to New York. Charlotte inherited nothing from her father's downfall, except the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served, and a trust fund that had been kept separate from his business dealings, which she used to establish the Western Justice Foundation. The foundation's mission was to protect the rights of indigenous peoples and promote ethical development in the Western territories. The work was challenging and often frustrating, but it gave her life meaning in a way that her privileged Boston existence never had. 2 years after their parting at the train station in Greeley, Charlotte received a letter from Lakota. His band had successfully negotiated a new treaty that guaranteed their rights to ancestral lands, while allowing for limited development that would benefit both communities. He was serving as a cultural liaison between the tribal government and territorial authorities, helping to build the kind of cooperation that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The letter included a photograph of Lakota standing beside a young Cheyenne woman with intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. His wife, he explained, was a teacher who was working to preserve their traditional language and stories while preparing their children for the challenges of a changing world. Charlotte smiled as she studied the photograph, seeing in Lakota's expression the same contentment she had found in her own work. They had both discovered that true freedom came not from escaping responsibility, but from choosing which responsibilities to embrace. As she sat in her office overlooking the Potomac River, Charlotte touched the beaded bracelet that still adorned her wrist and thought about the journey that had brought her to this place. The frightened girl who had climbed aboard that stagecoach in Wyoming seemed like someone from another lifetime, someone whose problems had been so small and whose worldview had been so narrow. The woman she had become understood that freedom was not a destination, but a continuous choice. The choice to stand up for what was right, to use whatever privilege she possessed in service of justice, to build bridges between worlds that seemed impossible to connect. It was a lesson worth learning and worth sharing with anyone brave enough to listen. Years later, when journalists asked Charlotte about her transformation from socialite to activist, she would always credit a Cheyenne warrior named Lakota, who had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. The bracelet on her wrist, now worn smooth by years of wear, remained her most treasured possession, a reminder of the friendship that had changed the course of history. The wind off the Potomac carried the scent of coming rain, and Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, remembering another kind of wind across the Wyoming prairie. Somewhere out there, Lakota was probably teaching his own children the lessons he had learned during their desperate flight across the territory. Lessons about courage, about justice, about the kind of hope that could survive even the darkest times. They had both come so far from that morning when a stagecoach robbery had thrown them together by what she had once thought was chance. But Charlotte no longer believed it had been chance at all. Some meetings were meant to happen, some friendships were forged by forces larger than individual choice, and some stories once begun continued to unfold long after the final words were written. Charlotte opened her eyes and returned to her work, carrying with her the knowledge that true freedom was not something you found, it was something you created, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of standing up for what was right at a time. The Wyoming wind had taught her that lesson, and she would never forget it.